Throughout the year, Book TV attends author events, conferences, and book fairs to speak with nonfiction authors. At the National Press Club's annual book fair in Washington, D.C., we spoke with Ira Shapiro about the future of the Senate.
Ira Shapiro, give us a sense of your career.
My career is, for want of a better word, long. It goes back, actually, my love of the Senate goes back 50 years to when I was coming out of college during the last crisis in our country, Vietnam. And the Senate was a beacon of hope for a lot of us, and it drew me into public service. So I worked in the Senate for 12 years after law school. I got an internship first and then came back, and then went into government in the Clinton administration. And I've been in private sector since then, but always interested in the Senate and saddened by its long decline, which prompted my first book 6 years ago, The Last Great Senate, and now this one, The Least Great Senate, Broken.
What's broken about the Senate, in your view?
Well, I think generally everyone pretty much agrees that the Senate is just terribly divided in bitter partisanship. And the problem is that the partisanship that is dividing the Senate was the place where people came together, where the parties came together to work things out. It was Lin-Manuel Miranda Hamilton's room where it happened. When it doesn't happen in the Senate, the whole system seizes up. And that's what's happened. Hyper-partisanship, and now abuse of the process and abuse of the institutions. I don't usually go more than a minute without saying the name of Mitch McConnell, who I regard as the most damaging Senate leader of all time, and the most powerful.
Why do you call him the most damaging?
Because traditionally, Peter, Senate leaders felt it incumbent on them to work together across party lines. Senators on both sides, so they made that work. Senate leaders felt the need to work with presidents, whichever the party was. McConnell doesn't operate that way. So he's the leader of the Republicans and not the leader of the Senate. So he can be an obstructionist when Obama's president, and then steamroller when Trump is president. He's been very successful, but that's contrary to the way the Senate ever worked.
How do you think Harry Reid did?
Always the question that gets asked. Whenever I say anything about McConnell, somebody says, what about Harry Reid? I don't think he was a successful leader, and I think he was too much of a partisan also. And the two of them together were a terrible team. But McConnell has been the dominant force, both during the Obama years, when all he had to do was obstruct, and now during the Trump years.
Ira Shapiro, given your sense of history of the Senate, what about the so-called nuclear option and a potential end to the filibuster?
I think that the nuclear option, which so far has been applied only to the courts, has been quite disastrous already. And the loss of this filibuster would change the Senate fundamentally in legislative matters. But if you think about it, Pete, one of the concerns I have is that they've already changed the Senate quite a bit so that they were able to try to destroy the health care system, repealing the Affordable Care Act with only 50 votes plus the vice president. So there are various ways to abuse the institution. What we need is leaders on both sides who are committed to having the Senate play the special role it's supposed to play in our country. Mondale called it, when he was vice president and senator, he called it the nation's mediator. If the problems don't get worked out in the Senate, they don't get worked out.
Let's go back a little bit. I know Tom Daschle is a friend of yours. Tom Daschle and Trent Lott, did they work together?
They did. Tom Daschle and Trent Lott, in my view, were the last pair of Senate leaders who worked the way they were supposed to. Very different philosophies. One a Democrat, one a Republican, far apart. but they recognized the need to work together to make the Senate work for the Senate and for the country. So I have a section in my book about the Clinton impeachment trial, which shows Lott and Daschle working together to steer the trial in a way that works for the country.
Let's go back just a little bit more in history. Two more. Bob Dole, Lyndon Johnson.
I think Bob Dole was a terrific Senate leader in the 80s. I think he was excessively partisan in the 70s, and he slipped back a little bit in the 90s when he was starting to run for president, and he was facing the rebellion in the Republican circles that we usually identify with Newt Gingrich. So I have a high regard for Dole. He was a great patriot, and he was a great leader in the 80s. Lyndon Johnson was will always be remembered from Caro's great book as the master of the Senate. I think he had much less lasting effect on the Senate than Mike Mansfield, who came after him. Johnson passed through the Senate. Mansfield was there 16 years as leader. He set the tone for the Senate that was bipartisan and based on trust and respect. And the reason I know Mansfield was the greatest leader is because Mitch McConnell has said so. He says Mansfield's the leader he most admired, except he's basically the anti-Mansfield.
The book is called Broken: Can the Senate Save Itself and the Country? The author is Ira Shapiro. This is Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
Thank you.
Keep an eye out for more interviews from the National Press Club's book fair to air in the near future. You can also watch them and any of our other programs in their entirety at booktv.org. Type the author's name in the search bar at the top of the page.